Somewhere in the red dirt of inland Queensland, there may be several thousand brand new motorcycles rotting in the dark, sealed in their factory crates, never ridden, never sold, deliberately put into the ground by the men who were ordered to make them disappear. That is the story, at least. The story that has circulated for 80 years among collectors, metal detectorists, and old soldiers' families in Australia and the United States. A story of waste on a scale almost too large to picture. Thousands of Harley-Davidson WLA motorcycles, fresh from the crate, driven into a pit and buried. You are about to hear that story exactly as it has been told for generations. But you are also going to hear something the YouTube videos rarely tell you. Whether it actually happened exactly this way is one of the most contested questions in Pacific War surplus history. And the real answer, the one buried underneath the legend, might be even stranger than the myth itself. By the middle of 1945, Australia was not just a wartime ally of the United States. It had become one enormous American supply depot. Northern Queensland alone hosted staging bases, airfields, motor pools, and storage yards built to service the entire Southwest Pacific campaign. Douglas MacArthur had run his headquarters from Brisbane before pushing north. Convoys of American trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, and motorcycles rolled off ships at Townsville and Cairns by the tens of thousands, destined for New Guinea, the Philippines, and eventually the planned invasion of Japan itself. The Harley-Davidson WLA, the workhorse dispatch motorcycle of the American military, was part of that flood. Harley-Davidson had built roughly 88,000 of these machines during the war, shipping them to Britain, Canada, China, the Soviet Union, and, in enormous numbers, to the Pacific Theatre through ports exactly like the ones in Queensland. Every single crate that arrived in Australia was built for a war that everyone assumed would last well into 1946, possibly 1947. Nobody was planning for peace. And that miscalculation is the seed of everything that came next. Then came August. 2 atomic bombs, a sudden Soviet declaration of war on Japan, and an emperor's broadcast that stunned the entire world. The war that the United States had spent 4 years preparing to fight for years longer simply stopped, and it stopped almost overnight. Assembly lines that had been building trucks and motorcycles for the invasion of the Japanese home islands kept running for weeks before the orders finally caught up with reality. Ships already loaded with military hardware kept arriving in Pacific ports because nobody had told the shipping schedules that the war was over. In Queensland alone, warehouses and staging yards were suddenly sitting on an ocean of equipment that no one needed anymore. The United States had spent nearly $4 billion worth of material scattered across the Pacific, and almost none of it had anywhere left to go. Bringing it all home was not really an option. Shipping space across the Pacific was desperately needed for something far more urgent than crated motorcycles. It was needed to bring hundreds of thousands of American servicemen home to their families, a program known as Operation Magic Carpet. Every cargo hold devoted to hauling surplus jeeps back to California was a cargo hold not carrying soldiers back to their mothers, wives, and children. The math was brutal, and the priorities were obvious. Equipment lost the argument every time. Meanwhile, selling the material back to the Australian government sounded simple in theory, but under the terms of the wartime Lend-Lease agreement, none of this equipment could simply be handed over or resold on the open market without a formal accounting between two governments. Someone had to decide, item by item, category by category, what was worth shipping home, what was worth selling, and what was simply going to be destroyed where it sat. That decision fell to a tangled web of American commanders acting under the Surplus Property Act, and to a brand new Australian body called the Commonwealth Disposals Commission, created in 1944 specifically to manage the avalanche that everyone could see coming. What none of them fully anticipated was just how enormous that avalanche would be, or how fast they would need to make decisions that would echo for decades. The negotiations between American and Australian officials over the surplus stockpile were, by the accounts of people who lived through them, exhausting and often absurd. The United States initially wanted to be paid something close to the original wartime value of the equipment. The Australian government, staring at mountains of trucks, generators, tents, and motorcycles it had never asked for, and had limited ability to absorb into a small peacetime economy, balked. Over months of back and forth, the American asking price collapsed, by some accounts falling to a fraction of the original figure, sometimes cited as low as 5 to 10% of the original value, before Australia agreed to buy the remaining stock in bulk. Once that deal was struck, the Commonwealth Disposals Commission became responsible for actually getting rid of it, auctioning what could be auctioned, scrapping what could be scrapped, and in the case of items considered too dangerous, too specialized, or simply too plentiful to sell to civilians, destroying it outright. Military specification vehicles, engines built to non-civilian tolerances, and equipment that competed directly with Australia's fragile post-war manufacturing base were treated with particular suspicion. A country trying to rebuild its own peacetime industry did not necessarily want its market flooded with tens of thousands of free or nearly free American motorcycles. That tension between usefulness and threat is where the real story of destruction begins. There were real people caught in the middle of this, junior officers barely out of their 20s, suddenly handed authority over millions of dollars of equipment and almost no guidance on what to do with it. Area commanders across the Pacific were given the power to simply declare property excess and order its disposal, a chain of authority that ran from local depot officers up through the commander, service squadrons, Pacific Fleet, and eventually to the Foreign Liquidation Commission back in Washington. On paper, it looked orderly. In practice, a base commander staring at a monsoon season bearing down on an open-air motor pool full of unshipped vehicles had very little patience for waiting on approval from a desk 6,000 miles away. Decisions that should have taken months were sometimes made in an afternoon. Men who had spent years fighting to protect this equipment were now under orders to get rid of it as fast as humanly possible, and speed, not sentiment, dictated almost everything that followed. And destruction, it turns out, was not a rumor. It was policy, carried out in the open across an enormous stretch of the Pacific. This is the part of the story documentary videos love to gloss over, because it sounds almost too extreme to be true, and yet it is thoroughly documented. In Borneo, Australian disposal teams operated a site troops nicknamed Wreck Gorge, where jeeps, amphibious vehicles, trucks, and weapons carriers were driven off a ridge into the ravine below, piled with spare tires, doused in fuel, and set ablaze with a flare pistol. Witnesses described the fire burning for close to 3 weeks. On the island of Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides, now Vanuatu, the American Navy pushed bulldozers, forklifts, 6-wheel drive trucks, and crates of unopened supplies down a ramp built from dead coral straight into the ocean, a site so infamous it is now called $1 Million Point and remains a scuba diving attraction to this day. On Oahu, in Hawaii, an August 1946 Navy report described a single vast crater, packed with thousands of vehicles of every type, guarded, almost comically, by 1 officer and 2 enlisted men. Across the entire Pacific Theater, this program of disposal, redistribution, and destruction was formerly known as Operation Roll-Up, and it was staggering in scale. 9 million tons of material had to be sold, given away, shipped home, or destroyed, and almost none of the men assigned to do it had enough time, manpower, or clear instructions to do it carefully. So when a story surfaces claiming that thousands of brand new Harley-Davidson WWII motorcycles were bulldozed into a pit somewhere in the Queensland outback and buried rather than sold, it is not coming out of nowhere. It is landing on top of a mountain of very real, very well-documented precedent. Trucks were burned in Borneo. bulldozers were drowned off Vanuatu. Entire vehicle parks were abandoned on Pacific Islands with almost no one watching them. Against that backdrop, burying a few thousand motorcycles in Australian farmland sounds less like an outlandish myth and more like business as usual. And that is exactly why the Queensland Harley legend has survived for 80 years, because everyone who hears it already knows it happened somewhere else, to something else, and assumes it must have happened here too. But here is where the story gets complicated, because when historians, journalists, and collectors have actually gone looking for hard documentation of a specific Queensland Harley-Davidson burial site, a named pit, a unit history, a disposal ledger, a location that has ever actually produced a motorcycle, they have consistently come up empty. This is a pattern that repeats itself with uncomfortable regularity across former Allied military zones. Devon, in England, has its own nearly identical legend, a wartime American staging ground supposedly concealing crates of unused Harleys under what is now an industrial estate. Amateur digs organized specifically to find that stash have come back with nothing. Burma has its famous story of buried Spitfire fighters, a legend so persistent it eventually triggered a funded, high-profile excavation, and that excavation also found nothing resembling the original claim. The pattern across all of these stories is strikingly consistent. Real disposal did happen, on a massive scale, but the specific, vivid, easily quotable version, the exact number, the exact location, the sealed crates untouched by time, tends to dissolve the moment anyone tries to pin it down with a shovel. What almost certainly did not happen, at least not in the specific form the legend describes, is thousands of brand new unused Harley-Davidsons being deliberately entombed as a single dramatic event at one named site in Queensland. So what actually happened to the WLA Harleys in the Pacific Theatre, if not that? The real answer is less cinematic, but arguably more interesting, because it involves an entire hidden economy of post-war redistribution that most documentaries never touch. A significant number of American surplus motorcycles in Australia were formally transferred to Australian military use rather than destroyed. The Royal Australian Army's Corps of Signals had operated its own fleet of WLA pattern motorcycles throughout the war, and continued using them well into the late 1940s and even the early 1950s, absorbing additional American stock as it became available through the Lend-Lease drawdown. Other motorcycles passed through the Commonwealth Disposals Commission's public auctions between 1945 and 1949, sold to civilian buyers, postal services, farmers, and returning servicemen who had grown to trust the machine during the war and wanted one of their own at a fraction of its original cost. Some were stripped for parts by scrap dealers chasing the value of copper, aluminum, and rubber rather than the motorcycle itself. And undoubtedly some smaller number genuinely were destroyed, dumped, or simply abandoned to rust in remote yards precisely because moving, storing, or accounting for them individually cost more than the machines were worth on paper. The truth is not that the Harleys vanished into one dramatic pit. The truth is that they vanished into 1,000 smaller, quieter decisions made by exhausted disposal officers trying to clear an impossible backlog before the wet season, the funding, or their own patience ran out. That reality, scattered and bureaucratic as it is, tends not to survive as a story the way a single buried treasure does. Human beings do not tell each other stories about paperwork and auction catalogues. They tell each other stories about secret pits in the outback, about a fortune in machinery sleeping under the red earth, waiting for the right person with the right map to dig it up. That is the version that gets repeated at swap meets, whispered among collectors, and eventually typed into a script exactly like this one. And once a version like that exists online, it tends to multiply. Search engines reward vivid, specific claims over careful, hedged ones. A headline promising 3,000 buried motorcycles in a named location performs better than an article explaining post-war disposal bureaucracy, And so the vivid, unverifiable version keeps getting reproduced, video after video, blog post after blog post, each one borrowing confidence from the last without anyone actually returning to a primary source. What you are watching right now may itself be one link in that same chain, which is exactly why it matters to say clearly. This is a legend, not a documented event, and the difference matters. What makes the underlying story worth telling anyway is that the myth is standing on the shoulders of something completely real, and frankly, more remarkable than fiction. The genuine scale of post-war destruction across the Pacific dwarfs almost anything a single Queensland pit could hold. Aircraft by the hundreds were bulldozed and burned on islands from the Philippines to New Guinea rather than shipped home because a fighter plane built for a 5-year service life had no civilian market and cost more to ship than it was worth. Entire truck parks sat abandoned on Pacific atolls until the jungle reclaimed them, some still being found by researchers and divers decades later. The economics were simple and brutal. Shipping a jeep or a motorcycle 6,000 miles back to an American port, then paying to store, refurbish, and eventually auction it, frequently cost more than the machine would ever sell for once. War surplus prices collapsed under the sheer weight of supply. Destroying it in place, however wasteful it looks in hindsight, was often the cheapest option available to officers working against the clock. It is genuinely strange, and genuinely true, that some of the mightiest military-industrial output in human history ended its life not in glorious combat, but in a ditch, on a beach, or at the bottom of a lagoon because nobody could justify the freight bill to bring it home. And that irony has only deepened with time. The Harley-Davidson WLA that a Commonwealth Disposals Commission clerk in 1947 might have logged as scrap value, barely worth the paperwork to process, is today one of the most sought-after military motorcycles in the world. Restored, documented examples with matching numbers and verifiable service histories now sell for sums that would have seemed like fantasy to the soldiers who once rode them through the mud of New Guinea, let alone to the disposal officers who burned or buried the ones they could not sell. Collectors comb through old Australian farm sheds, war-era junkyards, and rural properties near former American staging areas, hoping to find exactly one of these machines forgotten in a barn. And it does happen, just not on the scale, or in the single dramatic burial, that the Queensland legend describes. The men who destroyed this equipment in 1945 were making a rational economic calculation for their time. History simply had other plans for what these machines would eventually be worth. Part of what makes the WLA such fertile ground for a legend like this one is the motorcycle itself. It was never meant to be glamorous. Harley-Davidson built it to a stripped-down utilitarian Army specification, a 45 cubic inch side valve V-twin, a leather ammunition scabbard bolted to the front forks, blackout lighting designed to make it nearly invisible from the air at night, and a top speed that would embarrass a modern commuter bicycle. Dispatch riders used it to carry orders between units when radios failed or were too risky to use. Military police used it for convoy escort. It was never issued as a prestige machine, which is exactly why so few people in 1945 imagined it would ever be worth protecting. A jeep at least had obvious civilian utility on a farm. A tank obviously belonged in a museum. A stripped-down Army dispatch motorcycle looked, to a tired disposal officer, like exactly the kind of thing you could write off without a second thought. That is precisely the gap the legend lives in. An object so unglamorous in its own time that its casual destruction feels entirely believable, and so valuable today that the idea of thousands of them being thrown away feels like a crime against history. That gap is also why the search never really stops. Collectors in Australia still comb through old dairy sheds, quarry sites, and former American staging grounds near Townsville, Charters Towers, and Mount Isa, chasing rumours that trace back, almost without exception, to a story someone's grandfather told at a barbecue decades ago. Occasionally, a genuine wartime WLA does turn up in a shed or a scrapyard, forgotten rather than buried, and each discovery breathes new life into the larger legend, even though a single rusted motorcycle found under a tarp is a very different thing from 3,000 buried in a pit. The line between the two keeps blurring with every retelling until the exception starts to sound like proof of the rule. So did the United States Army bury 3,000 brand new Harley-Davidsons in a pit in Queensland in 1945? The honest answer, the one most documentaries will not give you, is that no primary source, no unit record, no disposal ledger, and no confirmed excavation has ever produced hard evidence that it happened exactly that way. What did happen, provably and on a much larger scale, was a chaotic, improvised, and often wasteful continent-spanning liquidation of America's Pacific war machine, one that really did include burning trucks in Borneo, drowning bulldozers off Vanuatu, and abandoning vehicle parks across a dozen islands, an operation so large that a single buried Queensland Harley cache would barely register as a footnote even if it were real. The legend endures not because it is proven, but because it captures, in one vivid and memorable image, a truth that is otherwise too sprawling and too bureaucratic to fit into a single story. That the same nation capable of building an army powerful enough to win the largest war in history was, within months of victory, quietly and unceremoniously throwing enormous pieces of that army away. If this kind of hidden history fascinates you, the story of what really happens to a war machine after the fighting stops, make sure you are subscribed, because there are dozens more of these forgotten chapters waiting to be uncovered. Somewhere out there, in a field, a gorge, or the bottom of a lagoon, the 20th century's discarded arsenal is still waiting to be found. We will keep digging for it. See you in the next one.